This is a production of Cornell University.
I'm really delighted to be here today. And this first slide just shows a few of the garden staff that we have. It's a very small staff. So I was explaining this morning that there's one gardener for vegetables, one for flowers, one for native plants, and one for fruit. So, and then we have a few helpers. The two people in the center were helpers until recently. So let me try to make this go forward. Okay, so you might wonder what a gardener thinks about when they're gardening every day, 8 hours a day. And so I got thinking about how Jefferson's plants really kind of fuse three or more different climatic areas, and he kind of brings them to the kitchen and become the origin of Southern foodways, more or less is starting at Monticello as well as other places. So that's the topic of my talk today. If you haven't been to Monticello, the garden is 1,000 feet long and it's on its own terrace. The main house you can see is uphill, and then Jefferson in 1806 started having 7 slaves to dig out the mountainside to make this beautiful terrace for the garden. It's about 2 acres long. And it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the whole place, because of so many activities that Jefferson was involved in, and it's a real hub for new thought in the Enlightenment era. So here's the garden. When you are descending the steps, you can see the terrace. This is This is when the sun is sinking in the west. It's actually a very south-facing garden, and it has this bank that acts as a thermal mass. The design of the garden is in squares. The squares have grass paths between so that you can access the garden when it rains, because it's clay soil that gets really compacted. We have 98% compaction after construction. So, and the dimensions are exactly what Jefferson had, and my goal is to grow all the plants that Jefferson had as well, if I can determine what they are. So this is, I put in this because we did have archaeology in the garden on the bank at one point, and up in the upper left you can see that image is a sketch that Jefferson made of the garden bank in steps, so that he would have these thorny bushes placed along the bank, I think maybe to stop erosion or animals. He calls it the olitory, and that's a fascinating word because oleracea is in so many botanical names, and it means it comes from the kitchen garden, it's a vegetable. If you ever see officinalis on a name, it's more or less a medicinal plant. So and that it comes from that Latin word olus, which means pot, herb, or vegetable. So Devin Floyd is standing there next to this clay bank, and you can see that he actually, when they go back to the original soil in the bank, they can find these steps that were designed by Jefferson, and that rock conglomeration there, that is actually at the base. And it seems like maybe in Jefferson's day, there really was erosion. This is not a faced stone wall. This is just stacked in there, kind of like, let's get this thing from collapsing. And if I go back, you can see it's a 45-degree angle today. And Jefferson's day, it would have had an extra 6 feet of garden space. And the wall is actually 70 degrees. It's almost vertical. So I would love to have that, but it's impractical. And they've only excavated this certain little area where they intended to put pipes through the garden. They haven't done the rest of the wall. I really wanted them to find glass. I really wanted a cold frame, but it didn't happen for me. So Jefferson's garden, this huge area, it's 2 acres, was always intended as an experimental laboratory. And he's trying out all kinds of plants, everything he can find. If he hears anything in a newspaper, he writes a letter, says, send me that cucumber, send me that gourd. I want to try it here. He wants to try and find which 2 are the best to grow in Virginia. And so he also, of course, takes these things to the kitchen. There's a picture of the garden this spring. I grew a lot of tomatoes this year because we were making a tomato jam, but we grow them all up on poles. So here and there you'll see little methods that we use. One example is this Texas bird pepper. Someone sends it to him from Texas. And so this is the only reason he has it is somebody sent it, and it's a hot weather plant. It's from, and he says right there, if it's hardy enough for our climate, then it'll live. So he's thinking about climate all of his whole life. So this is a kind of chiltepin, it's really tiny. So in his lifetime, he has a huge list of things. You can see 48 kinds of beans, 15 kinds of broccoli. So not all of these are specifically identified as varieties like we have today, because they didn't have botanical nomenclature in his day. It was developing. And he has things from friends, or he's calling something forward, which might mean it grows earlier or faster. So I tried my best to figure out what all of these things mean. And then so far, well, this year I had 230 vegetables and herbs. And last year I had like 250. It was kind of a short year. So you can see they have some unusual things. And at the end, I'll show you some plants. So I'll have a little plant quiz. So in 1774, he grew 7 kinds of pumpkins. And if you have a garden, how many of you have ever grown 7 kinds of pumpkins? It's like, so he did have space along the river to try these out. So I'm always looking for that black pumpkin. What could that be? What is a black pumpkin? So we do have the sweet potato pumpkin. We can grow Marina di Chioggia. That's the Zucca di Pescatore. If you read Italian books, then it's that knobby, that green worded, and they are still growing it. And it's so cool to find, to really nail something down. I grow the white bower pumpkin, Zucca bianchi, because it's from the 1600s, and the Boers had great gardens in South Africa, and possibly, you know, he had it. So I kind of have these leaps of faith. So Jefferson was keeping weather data his whole life, and he claims climate is one of the sources of greatest sensual enjoyment. I don't know how many of you agree with that statement, but he wants everybody to take weather. He has this idea that we need to gather this and make a nationwide index of climate. And so every morning he rises and he takes the temperature. At 4 p.m. he takes the temperature, and he gathers this data for his whole life. And you can see in Philadelphia, he's gathering it. If he leaves Virginia, he asks somebody to take the data for him. And so here's charts and charts of data. And so he also wants the appearance of birds, of frosts, the leafing out of trees. He wants all of this phenological data, which is so important and so valuable to us. And then when Lewis and Clark goes west, he wants all of these data. They're not only are they taking a boat west, but they have to observe temperature, frost, wind, time of flowering plants. And then when he goes to Europe, he has the Virginians back home to keep the data. Some of them do. I think Madison does. And then he has this really cool thing, what I recommend to a lot of people who have new gardens. He says, take a thimble every Monday and plant a thimbleful of lettuce in your garden. And he says from February to September. You can see it down below. That is, and you go through the summer. And so now today, we know lettuce will not germinate at over 85 degrees in the ground. It's going to be dormant. But in his day, they didn't take soil temperatures. But you can see that he's going to establish spring planting times and fall planting times just because of the failures. And if you look in the book and it says fails to mature, fails to come up, I think those are actually opportunities to figure out what is going on. And so I never considered Jefferson ever really thinking he's failing at anything. It's like, this didn't work. Why didn't it work? This is a leap into what I can figure out and how to make it work for me. And so he has this gardening calendar, and you can see February 1st, he's putting out, the asparagus stuff, but February 15th, sow the peas, lettuce, spinach, and celery. When he starts out as a young man in 1767 planting his garden, he's planting lettuce in May. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, no, that's wrong. And so May is way too hot for lettuce. By the time he gets to this calendar, which is 1824, he's figured out that he has a really early planting date for these things, or it's going to be too hot in Virginia to do it. Because he's coming from, maybe his ancestry is Scottish and it's like cold weather plants. He's got to figure out with a climate for Virginia to do it. So this is really cool. We follow this schedule. If we don't have peas in on Lincoln's birthday, we won't have seeds. The plants will perish without producing seeds for us. So, so then he almost has the phenology of things. So this is a Rocky Mountains calendar, but you can actually make this for your own calendar. But we know when flea beetles when the red buds are blooming, we'll have flea beetles in the garden. It's just synchronous. So this is a calendar because it was convenient to put in. It's not really from Virginia, but you can make one of these yourself if you keep data in a little notebook. And so he almost has the growing degree day thing, I think, because he's got all the data. He's got the high and low temperatures each day, and growing degree days when you add it together and divide it by 2. And so if a pea comes up, you start your growing degree day calculations. I think it's 338 days. You have two leaves on the pea. So I'm hoping one day to go back through all those charts and figure out his growing degree days versus our growing degree days. Wouldn't that be terrific? But he's almost got it. He's almost there. It's really fascinating. So here he is. He also gets these foods from different climates. And so he's got, of course, the enslaved are bringing foods from Africa and the West Indies. He's got his own salad bowl, culture. And then he's got the Native American foods that arrived with the Lewis and Clark expedition. This is one of the examples of a cold weather Northern European kind of crop that's really technical to grow, because this is sea kale. How many of you know the sea kale? Oh, you do. Cool. Well, so it grows on the beach, and the culture back then was like the beach would cover it with the gravel, and you dig it out and it would be light colored. Well, we have sea kale pots. You can see a pot nearby. You cover the plant when it's emerging, and you get this beautiful yellow stalks. Jefferson, in his day, they would have potted them up, bringing them inside, and forced them all winter. This is not an easy thing to grow. This is not a, just throw the seeds in and have a beet or a carrot. So today we have centers of origin, and I was really pleased to see that you have that kind of demonstration at the plantations. So you have certain plants came from certain climates, and if you can figure out where they're from, then you can grow them at the right time of year. Especially in Virginia, we have like a 10-month growing season. You can just plug things in at the right time, and then they'll flourish. So that's a really cool thing. So I've got this picture with the castor beans, because you can see that they're from, I think, over there on the African center of origin, and there's peanuts and cottons from South America, and over here you have flax and so forth from Near Eastern. So there's no flax in this picture, but this is a picture taken like 2 days ago in the garden. We haven't had any frost yet. So, and here's some peppers from South America, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a lot of North American crops, not many Chinese crops for us in our garden.
Referencing that previous slide, is there evidence of enslaved people having brought seeds with them from their native lands?
Yeah, that's a great question, because actually the food that was on the ships to feed them were their native foods. And that's how a lot of these things came to us. And I'll show you a couple of those in a second. So Jefferson went to Paris to be, he had various civic duties there. But I wanted to show you what Paris looked like this is 1792. All of the green areas. If you've been to Paris lately, you'll notice that those green areas are probably not green any longer. But in the corner is his, can I walk over there? This is his house. This is his vegetable garden. And when I saw that image, I thought, what was he growing in that garden? That is enormous. All the rest is like pleasure gardens with trees, and he has the stables over there. And then everything around him is gardens. So he really, I think, has a lot of influence from his Paris experience. So this little list in the book, it was a letter. Francis Epps was his relative. He sends these seeds back to Virginia from all of these different things. There was like, I think, 4 kinds of cauliflower, like 5 kinds of peas. You can see the whole list. And so that's fascinating to me. I wanted to grow the Paris garden. So then the things that he's missing when he's in Paris are the things at the bottom: sweet potatoes, and corn, and watermelons. Those things aren't in Paris. So I thought that was fascinating. That's the real Virginian over there, wishing he had, some hominy. So we did grow the garden of Paris in the 1780s, of the 1786 era, and you can see we have some cauliflowers, cabbages. This pea, I was really proud to actually find this pea. He calls it the dwarf gray pea of Holland for frames. And we actually, through some research and looked through all these old books, and it's actually the degraced sugar pea that you can get from Baker Creek Seeds. And it grows beautifully. And so to me, if I grow something that I think is what he's talking about, and it grows wonderfully, and maybe if he's grown it a couple years, that must be, it most likely is what he had. I don't think he'd keep growing something that doesn't grow well. So anyway, that's really a good thrill, and so to speak. So he meets Andre Tuin, and they have basically the same lifespan, which is very interesting. Tuin dies 2 years before Jefferson, and he had the Jardin des Plantes, which is called the Jardin du Roi back then. So they have a seed exchange, and Andre is sending up to 700 different seeds for things. Every year, big box would come. Finally, one year when the box didn't come, he said, "What happened to Andre's box?" And he had died, so that was sad. But they had a huge exchange, and Jefferson sends all kinds of trees to him. And so I suppose you could find out if we had any descendants over there or not. But that was one place where he got seeds. Another influence was Philip Mazzei, who was from Italy. Philip was an amazing guy who was here to establish a wine company and some agricultural interests, and became friends with Jefferson. And Mazzei starts to establish the vineyards for Jefferson, and he brings over 10 Italian gardeners. Many of them remained in the Charlottesville area, and there's descendants here today. And then all of his, of course, in the Paris era, all of his journal references are in French, and now all of the journal references are in Italian for when Philip is there. So you can still see we have these vineyards today, and you can notice the sort of rough wooden structures that are really difficult to take care of. And anyway, we have 22 varieties that they're attempted to grow on the left side, and on the upper side is Sangiovese grapes that we can harvest for wine. So what was interesting about Philip Mazzei is that if you look at this is a kind of a fuzzy picture, but if you look at the latitude between Virginia, which is sort of like in this little dent here, and you look over to where Philip was from, Italy, they kind of match. So he's kind of on the same latitude. And we actually looked at the ethnobotany of Philip's area and found salad burnet, for one thing. He calls it Salvestrella di Pisa. And I thought, what is that? And it's like, it sounds like burnet. And then we looked in there and we found it, and yes, it's salad burnet. So he's growing it really early on. And so some of these things we kind of can nail down by looking at that if Philip brought it over. So, and then Jefferson also travels in Italy while he's in Paris, and he finds olive trees that are 6 feet in diameter. It's amazing. He sees wine growing, Parmesan cheese, macaroni mold. It's not molding. It's the press that you can make macaroni from, and then rice and silk. And he tries to steal rice. There's a great famous story that you can look online and read about how he's in upland Italy with his donkey driver, and they go to this rice patch, and he really wants this certain kind of upland rice. And he says to the farmer, "Can I take a bag of rice home? I need a 50-pound bag of rice. I'm going to introduce it to South Carolina." He says, no, we have this regional, they still have this regional rule where you can't take things away from certain regions in Italy. He says, no, you can't have. So Jefferson said, "Okay, can I have a little bag of it? I'll put it in my pocket." He says, "Okay, you can have a bag of it." And then he tells his donkey driver, "You take a bag of it too." And if you go across the border, you can get killed for having this rice. But they get it, and then they brings it back to South Carolina, and they said, people in South Carolina said, we have this rice that we really like better. So there. Now, I'll tell you another rice story in a second. So I want to mention about food and how, because you don't understand how important the food aspect of this is until you look back and see that in the Middle Ages, food was mostly meat, and it was spiced up. And if you put time on something that's moldy, you can destroy bacteria. Time kills bacteria in 60 seconds or so. So you have all of these strange foods that basically are heavily spiced or, being sanitized by the herbs. And then they even put, I think they had gilded on them, and they had this meatloaf of birds that they put feathers over the top of. So there's a whole lot of heavy meat dishes. And we kind of exit that kind of era of food when John Evelyn was writing about food, and he also wrote about horticulture. And if you read about his quote about lettuces, he was really introducing the salad into the diet once again. And so his treatise of horticulture, he has acetary as a part of that, and he says lettuce is a principal foundation of the universal tribe of salads. And it has beneficial influences on morals, temperance, and chastity. I've never thought about that when I ate a salad. But he's a fascinating guy, and he's got great books, and he has all the tools listed that they had in that day. And then actually in Europe started being influenced by North American foods or South American foods with the beans, etc. So this big trade and a different change in diet to be more of vegetables. So wanted to mention this guy, La Varenne, who has a cookbook, and he is the person who's starting French foods that has the idea of vegetables tasting fresh. not vegetables stewed up and cooked into soups. This is fresh vegetables with a sauce. And it's the start of French cooking. This is an amazing book, and you can get it in translation. So Jefferson goes to Paris. He brings along Sally to take care of his 2 daughters. But then James, Sally's brother, these were slaves, comes over and he has James apprenticed to his caterer. And then he sends him to Chantilly, which is a picture down below, to learn to cook in that kitchen. I was amazed. The kitchen is up there. You can see the size of it, all of the exquisite pots and technique. This is really top-notch stuff. They are serving kings and queens in this castle. So this is the kind of food that Jefferson is going to have. And when, I think I have another picture. Yeah, so James, for instance, he learns to make this beautiful fritter, and then he brings it back to Monticello. It continues as the bell fritters, and it becomes like apple fritters later. It kind of gets a little rustic after a while. But he's got this, this French influence. This is really top-notch, beautiful cooking. And so this is the kitchen that Jefferson builds when he gets back from France. And you can see on the left are stew stoves. You've got all the best copper pots. The hearth is back there with a clock jack that's kind of odd little thing in the middle, a bake oven on the right. He's got this stone mortar, which is amazing. That's for making pesto. This is a beautiful kitchen to work in. So I wanted to show you this because you can see the kitchen that we're familiar with. The stew stoves on the left, they allow you to put charcoal under a pot and have like a low temperature cooking. And you can regulate it with grids on top. The little outlays here, this is just to take ash away. Up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that pavilion. It's called a pavilion. It's the first structure Jefferson built at Monticello, and that was to live in. And downstairs was the kitchen. And it has been kind of a men's bathroom since the 1940s. And recently, we had enough money to excavate that and bring it back to be what it used to be. The interesting thing is that that pavilion doesn't match the level of Monticello house. This Monticello has the 2 terraces. And so this is at the end of one terrace. When he decides to build Monticello, it's the hillside that he's building on doesn't match. So he just has the workers fill the bottom of the pavilion in with 3 feet of fill. Just fill it up and we'll go on from there. And so the archaeologists then took out the 3 feet of fill this winter, and they had 40,000 artifacts in it because the yard's dirt is full of debris. And so they got amazing material. And at the bottom of it, they find the original stew stove foundations, and the charcoal from 1808 was in them. And so they found other parts of the whole kitchen. So that's very exciting to know that they actually had these stew stoves and stuff really early on, and then he builds this big kitchen to follow. And so the idea of that this food is really exquisite, and Jefferson was known to give really great dinners, etc. So that's fun. The bouquet garni, everybody knows about that. You put a bunch of herbs in soup, but it was a whole series of different kinds invented by this guy, Laveran. So Jefferson ends up growing all of these herbs that are mentioned by him. So that's one reason for it. Here's a list of herbs that he decides to grow in 1794. So that's pretty inspired. So we, of course, we grow all those herbs. And so the enslaved people have all of these plants that they bring as well. And Karen Hess has done a lot of work on, she's passed away now, but she has done a lot of work with finding these origins of Southern cuisine. So I'll show you, and Michael Twitty as well, he's just released a book about Southern cuisine. You can see he's cooking in our kitchen. And David Shields does a lot of work, very interesting work on finding sources for the original plant material. And he actually went to Trinidad recently because the Americans were a group of enslaved people that had been freed and hired by the British to fight in the War of 1812. And in return, they got free land in Trinidad, and they brought their seeds with them. And so the upland, the red upland bearded rice that Jefferson had, has been grown in Trinidad ever since. And so now it's in quarantine, and we'll come back to Monticello soon. So here's some of the seeds from the enslaved people. Like this is Benny or sesame, and it has a nice white flower, and then the pods make these beautiful seeds. And Jefferson was hoping to make oil from this instead of olive oil because olives didn't grow very well. at Monticello. You can grow lots of this. Here's okra. The okra plants grow really tall and huge, and they're used to make soups. And he grew it around his tomatoes as a barricade. Here's some eggplant. And it was, Jefferson felt that when Martha cooked the eggplants, it tasted like soft crabs. So I think he was pretty landlocked. The West India gherkin is an amazing thing that came in with the slaves. The seeds are extremely tiny, but the plant is so prolific. And this is a really tasty little crunchy cucumber that doesn't cross-pollinate with the average cucumber. So, and then sorghum is a kind of millet, and you can pop it, you can grind it, certain varieties have that sweet syrup in the stalk. So there's going to be, we're going to grow more of that in our garden, because Jefferson called it guinea corn at the time. And then the peanuts, we have the Carolina African runner peanut that actually came off of slave ship in 1670. And this is profusely prolific with peanuts. I don't know if you know how peanuts grow. Any of you seen peanuts? When they are pollinated, the flower sends a peg into the ground, and that forms the peanut nut underground. And so when you lift up a peanut plant, it's full of these pegs, and this actually creates a big mat of peanuts. They're really tiny, and they're used mostly for cooking oil. So and then the Lewis and Clark expedition left Monticello in 1803, and then went out to try to find the Pacific. And when they went up this branch of the river, they got up to about here when they met snow, and they built a fort and lived for until April of the next year with the products of the Mandan, Arikara, and Hidatsa tribes. Down at the bottom is the boat that the Mandans used, and on the right is the boat that Lewis and Clark expedition used. So their situation is cold. This is North Dakota, and I have a 3-month growing season. And so we actually have a seed exchange, and we got the beans and corn and sunflowers, etc., from the descendants of these tribes to grow at Monticello once again. So this Hidatsa bean is amazing. It's got one seed, that makes like 120 pods sometimes on one plant. It's really significant. They have a legend that one seed will feed 12 people, and it really comes out that way. When I first got the Hidatsa bean, I had 15 seeds and a 42-foot row. So I thought, what is going to happen here? But actually, each plant was so prolific. You can see the production. So in the short growing season, they get a lot of food that they can store. So here's the Mandan corn that we grow. On the left is the red clay corn, and then there's a white flower corn in the middle, and the red flower corn in the center. This is interesting because it's a really early historically corn. It only goes up to 4 or 5 feet tall, and the plant tillers out with the cobs along the bottom of the stalks. I'm thinking they don't have raccoons, because, but we don't have that issue. So for this corn, because it's so tiny, it's right next to the Hidatsa bean here, I hand pollinate all the cobs of corn to make sure we get a good crop. Here's the Arikara sunflower. This grows in cold weather as well. So like they plant it when the ice breaks up on the Missouri River. So for us, it's like March 25th. We put the seeds in the ground. It needs 45 degrees soil temperature. And so this sunflower picture was probably taken like June 1st or 2nd. So they grow really fast in the cold weather, and they're pizza-size heads. They're great. So here's the seed exchange. This is when we first started back in 2013. And it's been really interesting to grow these crops. And we grew some in the fall this year too. Pretty well. So here's Jefferson grew all of these different climatic regional plants. And so in his day, it was pretty amazing, because Jefferson and the colonists basically had spring gardens and fall gardens. They didn't grow summer crops. And so I hope you visit us at the garden someday soon. And here's my contact information. And then I'll give you a little plant quiz. We had this idea to show you some plants. So, let's see. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, can you see? Okay, so I did show you this plant. The stalk is really big. I've got it folded up 3 times. So does anybody recognize this? It's got these really great pods that when you open them up, all of the seeds are kind of lined up. It's like a little vending machine. Isn't that gorgeous? And then hopefully these have all left.
Sesame.
This is the sesame, right? It has a really nice little flower. You can see here's some young pods. We had a chef visit who decided to try to cook the young pods. You can see some seeds here. Right there, see? Gorgeous. Okay, so that grows really well for us. Show you some corn. Here's some corn. This is the Mandan red flower corn and the white flower corn. Although this is what I got to plant, this is what I got from it. It's interesting that we didn't get any blue ones, but maybe we just had yellow pollen, I don't know. But I wanted to show you that in relationship to Damon Morgan's Kentucky butcher corn. I'll take these away, which is a corn that we make into hominy. And if I open this one up, you can see the relative size of an ear of corn versus what the Indians were producing. So this, you can, from top to bottom, zoom. And the Indians were doing, the Mandans had 800 acres of their crop, and the tool that they used to garden with was this. Recognize this?
You can just hold it up.
Yeah. Okay. Zoom out. Oh, good. Look at there. Okay. Cool. So this is an antler. They would tie an antler to a stick, and they also the other hoe was made of a scapula from the buffalo. 800 acres, and then they figured out how to cache the food. And so then when visitors and like explorers from Canada, from the British, the Spanish all arrived at that place on the Missouri, they had plenty to sell. And so these Indians had all the latest in cooking pots, calico, pins, and needles. They were very sharp people. I got here some, anybody recognize these little fuzzies? Chestnuts. This is cotton. So I did see this one out in your garden here. This is the red foliated white cotton. And you can see the seeds are right here. This is a hirsutum cotton, which means, you know, the sticky seed, you know, the hirsute name, it means it's got this fuzz to it. This is the green lint cotton. Did you know there was green lint cottons? And this is also a sticky seed. This is probably Earlene's green. And then we have this one here. This is Nankeen cotton, and it's written about in Jefferson's books as a yellow cotton, and it made the cloth actually became called Nankeen from this. And then I have this cotton here. You can see the seeds are slipping out easily. So this is Sea Island brown cotton, and this is, I believe, a barbadense variety instead of hirsutum. Isn't that cool? Now, the thing about this is that all of these cottons with the sticky seeds grow better in Virginia. And so Jefferson needs a gin to take the seeds out because it takes so much time to pull this apart. So he gets the cotton gin. He's Secretary of State when, and also running the patent office when Eli Whitney sends in plans for the cotton gin. And he says, is this really a dream, or do you really have this machine? I really need like 2 of these. And so, so the gin is saws blades that will tear up the cotton off the seed. If you showed as somebody a gin with this kind of cotton, they would die because they're cutting the fibers up. The whole thing is that you want the longest fiber you can get and to be able to straighten it out and then twist it into thread. And so The Ecuadorians have a cotton that's very long fiber, about 4 inches long, and they just remove the seeds by hand and then straighten it out by whacking it with a stick on a pillow. And that's really beautiful long thread that they can make from there. And like Egyptian cotton is the barbadense as well. It's a smooth seeded. So that's pretty fascinating. I'll show you this crazy little thing. Recognize these? These are quite mature. Do you remember this, the gherkin? Yeah. I'll cut it in half. You can see how big these seeds are in here, how many seeds. It's really prolific. Look at all those seeds. Each seed is an entire plant. I'll cut this one this way. Fewer seeds when it's smaller, but still, what you want to do is get it when it's tiny, like this big, okay? So I just wanted to show you the gherkins. We just harvested them for seed recently. They're all gone.
And is the outer rind of that edible?
Yeah, the whole thing is edible, and so we know it's fun with kids because it's all prickly.
Mm-hmm.
Can you eat that prickly thing? So here's a couple of pods from our friend the okra. So I'll show you what they look like inside. When they're this size, they are pretty fibrous. So you can see the seeds in here. When they're smaller, about this size, then we eat them. Otherwise, we save them for seeds and for Christmas decorations. I'll show you this. I had 2 different varieties of this. Does anybody recognize this plant? This is a dried one. Yeah, this is a dried artichoke. We use this for Christmas as well. The artichokes we grow don't have very good flavor and qualities. And this is really fun. Recognize these? Jefferson called this the most minutest gourd ever seen, and he sends it to his grandchildren. It's the Tennessee spinning gourd, so you can grow toys in the garden. So who knew that Jefferson had a sense of humor, right? So I'll show you this. This is going to be hard for you to figure out. The most important part is right here at the top, right here. Take this off, crush it. And what do you have there? Lettuce seed. So I don't know if how many of you've seen lettuce go to seed, but in fact, here's all the seeds down here. Shake it out. We cut the heads off usually shorter than this, like about here. Dry the heads in the greenhouse, in a dry greenhouse, and then crush them through sieves to get the seeds out. And what's interesting is the ants love lettuce seed too. And so if we're in a rush, we can just pick up the newspaper, and underneath there'll be cute little piles of lettuce seed already clean. We just can scoop it up. And then I'll show you this plant. I'll put it under here because it's one side. Here's another side. Anybody recognize this? Tobacco. So we grow the Orinoco tobacco, which is what Jefferson would have had. Came from Suriname. There's great stories if you read a book by Afra Ben from the 1600s. The first book by a woman author describing the plight of slaves. And it became a stage play in the Victorian era. It's all about Orinoco, who was a slave. He was actually a prince to marry the princess, and he's sold as a slave. And then he and his wife-to-be have a pact that they're going to kill each other because they can't. Well, his wife is actually taken by his dad. It's like really bad stuff happens. So his last words is, all I want before I die is to smoke a pipe of Orinoco tobacco. So it's pretty good. But this is being dried now. And what I really liked this fall was that it was such a ladybug factory. You can see some evidence of bugs here. We had aphids galore, and then the aphids all attracted ladybugs and all kinds of beneficial insects that were using the honeydew. And it's amazing how many ladybugs we have in the garden because this happened on our sorghum last year. And so we had no reason to remove them. So we just let them go. When he had a ladybug larvae of every 6 inches or so, and the whole patch. It was just loaded. And a tobacco farmer came and I said, usually I wash all these leaves off because of all this stuff. And he says, no one else does. So just, so now I'll show you a couple of tools and then I'll be done, I think. Here's one special tool that I was telling you about right here. See? The thimble. How many of you have thimbles today? Oh, that's very impressive. So in Jefferson's day, every woman would have had it. Every woman and child would have had a thimble, and some men too. And I'll show you this beautiful thing that I got recently. And I saw this on one of your posters in the hallway. So does anybody know what this tool is? It's it swings, rotates. It's a string line. And so we use string lines for everything in the garden. And I use a compass with a string line to make sure everything is parallel. And then sometimes use measuring sticks to measure out the plants. Sometimes I use my feet. And so I love this thing. But this is actually 1800s. Something a little less extreme. But I wanted to show you that because that's what Jefferson, something like that is what Jefferson had. And this is what his Indian neighbors were using. Compare the different ways of gardening. It's just, really phenomenal. So thank you very much for putting up with my eccentricities. Do you have any questions?
Bill, you alluded a couple of times to critters and animals in the garden. So what do you folks have to do to keep
we do so many
else?
things. So are you talking about bugs or are you talking about four-legged?
No, four-legged, mammals.
Yeah, four-legged mammals. So we have an electric fence we put up every night for deer. And we have some woodchucks that are just monsters. We put up a fence every night, take it down every morning. We have 3 dogs that we let out to get the little animals, raccoons and stuff. We had a beautiful baby raccoon treed last year. He's really cute. And we have some fox, and we have other things, skunks. We've got a lot of animals because we're right in the woods, basically. We have a lot of birds. The crows are really obnoxious, so we put cages over any emerging corn or beans because they'll pull them right out. So yeah, we have to, and we let them get up to a good height before we take the cage off.
So the electrical fence, obviously not, but are these other methods sort of period appropriate? So any thoughts of what he did back then with these problems?
I don't know what his crow problem might have been, but he had a paling fence, which means ribbon boards, and it had been 12 feet high around the whole garden, including the fruit garden. So it was like almost a mile long fence. And the boards were close enough so he said so hair wouldn't go through, so a rabbit wouldn't go through. Before he had the fence built, Martha would write to him saying that the pigs are trashing the garden. So they had animal problems beyond ours.
Pat, would you ask if Geneva has any questions?
Geneva, do you have, up here on the.
That's Geneva right there.
Geneva, do you have a question?
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I was curious, one of your earlier slides said that he had 15 types of broccoli. That's the crop I'm working on. Have you ever been able to find or grow those kinds, or seen them, or know any extra information? I'm happy to send you an email instead, but
I'll show you the list that I have for broccoli.
oh wow,
So
okay.
do you recognize any of these?
I do.
I love seeds. We do grow. Sorry, it's shining, but we grow the white broccoli, the early purple. We've grown different kinds of green, and I just sort of label them as Roman or green or whatever. And then the black broccoli down there, this is what I want.
Thank you so much. We really enjoyed it up here.
Oh, good. Thanks.
Pat, I've heard conflicting things about whether Jefferson grew the love apple, the tomato.
The tomato, we have the pomme d'amour, yes, and it grows beautifully for us.
And there is evidence that Jefferson did in fact grow it?
So that's a tricky question, because in Jefferson's day, well, I'll show you what he says about tomato. It's tomata, Spanish tomato bigger than the other ones, and the dwarf tomato that runs around the ground like a weed. So that's all he's got to say. Here's tomato. So we know that he goes to Williamsburg and meets, well, his family physician is Dr. John de Siqueira, who, I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, but he's working at Williamsburg, and he advocates eating tomato every day for eternal health. So that's been changed over time, hasn't it? And so we know that's in the that's the 1760s or so, and then in 1781, in his notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson lists tomatoes along with muskmelons and passion fruit and everything else. So we know the tomato is, just being cultivated in Virginia without much fanfare. So, but this is all he says because of that issue of not having variety names. So we grow all kinds of tomatoes, and basically the Castelluto Genovese, Castelluto Catanese, because Italy has its regionality and has a tomato variety for each region. And they've been in cultivation since the 1500s. The Medici family had tomatoes. It became the food of the peasant. So I just try to grow things that grow well for us. And this year we grew Cherokee purple tomatoes, which did not grow very well at all. And it wasn't from seeds that we had saved over time. So I'm going to save some seeds and see if they'll grow better next year. But that's a modern 1990 tomato. And, it's just not suited. It's not suitable. Oh, this lady had a question forever.
Oh, okay. Do you have any sense of what regular folks in Virginia in 1805 were growing in their gardens? Vegetable
because
variety?
this is so amazing. There's some references. There's some guy named Edwin Ruffin who I was reading, and he was talking about manuring and crop rotation. So that's a great question, and it'd be interesting to see if any of Jefferson's information got dispersed to his neighbors. He did have his friend George Divers at Farmington, who's down in Charlottesville. We're uphill. We're at 800 feet up. Down in Charlottesville, George had his farm, and Jefferson would send some of his seeds to George as a plan B, like in case mine fail, you'll have the plant. And they had a pea contest, which is always touted to all the kids who had the first dish of peas, and then that person would give a big dinner with the peas. And so one year Jefferson's peas came in first, but he says to Martha, George just loves giving a dinner. We're not going to tell him our peas came in first. So there's some of that. But that's a great question. That's something I really should look into. Yeah. And so you had a question.
Yeah, there's a lot of records about Jefferson bringing in trees through exchange from France. Are there any of those trees grown on the property?
So it'd be really great if trees could persist 250 years, but
or at least
but we have records of what they are, and so we reintroduce those trees, and we have put them in the right spots. And one interesting thing is that he has that really large leaf magnolia. I think it's macrophyllum, and he's got it on the the house. And there's the garden, the flower garden, and then the slope is we call it the Upper Grove. He's got them sited there, and I should have taken a picture, but where they're sited, they're facing. It's the north facing here, and then the west. When the sun sinks in the west here, the north side of that tree trunk is frozen, and then when the west sunshine hits the trunk in the wintertime, it splits it. And so all of the magnolias have these splits in the trunk, and then they die, and we cut them off, and then they come back up. So they've been there over and over again, but it's a terrible location. But we put it in that location anyway.
That's an American tree, macrophylla. So did he bring any Asian or European trees?
Yeah, he gets things from Andre, from in Paris, a number of things, and those are written down too. I'm really not a tree expert. I spend a lot of time with vegetables.
So we have time for one more question. Anyone has one?
Two more questions.
So it seems like you have this large collection of plants with these fun histories to them.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering what the most effective way you found to kind of communicate these histories with visitors who are just kind of passing through the garden.
Yeah, well, it's we have this garden ambassador program with master gardeners from 10 to 2 who answer the question that everybody asks is what happens to all the vegetables? And I really, that's great. It takes all that weight off of me. So then when they have a really cool question, they send them over and I get to talk to them. And I can mention something like, did you know this is where sesame is? Or if we're just somewhere and somebody's poking around and saying, that looks like a, and then they get lost. You can say, oh, well, that's actually a pumpkin, or that's actually an eggplant. And then you can kind of go from there. So I really do try to help people along when they look interested in what they're seeing. Yeah. So.
Well, I want to again thank Pat for a fascinating.
Thank you very much.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.